Greetings, this is Greg. I want to talk about the FW190 Dora 9 systems, meaning the electrical system, the emergency extension system for the landing gear, the MW50 system, things like that. I'm going to be using DCS or Digital Combat Simulator to show some of these systems because it's a fully interactive cockpit, so I think that's much more effective to do it that way than to show a grainy wartime black and white photo and point to the switches there. I'm not saying that everything that I talk about, like the ground wire for the Magnetos, things like that, are necessarily modeled in DCS, but a lot of it is. So hopefully people that are into online or offline World War II simulators will find this information pretty useful. And even if you're not at all into simulators, I think you're going to find a lot of this really interesting. So let's get going. We're sitting in a Dora. We're at Carpaquet Airport in Normandy. And we're on the Wulf Pack server. I'll bring up the messages. You can see that here. This is a multiplayer server, but I'm not too worried about being attacked on the ground. I'm protected right now by a lot of anti-aircraft fire, plus there are friendly airplanes in the area. And worst case, I would just do an emergency takeoff and deal with it. But I don't think we're going to be interrupted. Now, please keep in mind that I am not trying to showcase DCS here in terms of graphics and sound and all the wonderful things DCS can do. There are plenty of other channels that do that. The resolution is turned way down in my simulator because I have an older computer and this is how I run it. So let's start by talking about the layout of the cockpit and the way you're going to set things up for engine start, taxi, takeoff, landing, or whatever. Pilots in real life tend to do things in specific orders. They call these flows, at least that's the modern term. So you're going to have a before engine start flow, or a before taxi flow, or a before takeoff flow. And they may or may not be backing that up with checklists. In the modern world, they certainly do. In World War II German fighter, I don't think so, but I guess I don't know for sure. Now, let's discuss the layout of the cockpit a little bit here. It's really set up in a very logical fashion that makes the flows very, very easy to do. I've scrolled down here, or I've tilted the view down. Keep in mind, it's not smooth because I'm doing it with buttons on my joystick instead of a head tracker, which is what I would normally use in game. But this is better for the purposes of what we're doing right now because, for example, right now the picture is perfectly still. All right, we need to draw an imaginary line here. Runs right across the cockpit here. A little bit, let's say, aft of the pilot's shoulders when he's sitting in the airplane. Everything aft of here is something that you are very rarely going to have to touch, maybe once per flight, and either at the very beginning of the flight or very end of the flight. So these are the things back here are things that you don't really need to mess with. And that makes sense. You lay out a cockpit that way. You want the important stuff forward, the less important stuff aft. Or maybe important is the wrong word, but the thing you'll fiddle with less. So we'll start on the left side here. This is just a plug to plug in the heated flight suit to keep you warm. Obviously, that's not a factor in a simulator. This is a button. You can press it like I just did. And what that does is self-destructs the identify friend or foe system. Although we have to keep in mind that in a simulator, we don't really have some radar operator sitting somewhere looking at radar identifying friend or foe. So other than to have it there for procedural things, it doesn't really do anything in the sim. But an example is if you ditched this airplane in friendly territory, before you get out and try and walk back to a friendly base or get captured or whatever, you press this button before you get out of the airplane and it destructs the IFF system. So these things over here, you're generally not going to mess with. This one here, you will rarely mess with. This handle, if you pull it up, will enable you to feed fuel from the MW50 tank. What do I mean by this? Well, if you're going to fly the Dora on a mission which requires range or endurance beyond what its normal internal fuel and droppable tank can provide, what you can do is fill the MW50 tank with fuel instead of with the methanol and water mixture. And so you can use that as a regular fuel tank and increase the range of the airplane. And if you have it set up that way, there are two specific things you're going to want to do. One, pull that up, and two, you're going to want to have this be off. You're going to want to turn off that MW50 pump. But normal airplane, you're going to be leaving all of this stuff over here alone. It won't be common, in my case, it's really never that I fly the airplane without MW50. The Dora has a fairly simple engine that is not set up to take advantage of high-octane fuel. It doesn't have some of the features like 4 valve per cylinder that, say, a Merlin or a Daimler-Benz engine would have. It relies on that MW50 spray and a lot of RPM in order to get power, and the plane needs a lot of power to be competitive. So if a Dora doesn't have MW, or if, let's say, I'm at an airfield and MW50 is not available, I'm not going to fly the Dora. I'm going to get out and walk over to that 109K4, because even if it doesn't have MW50, at least it can still run C3 fuel and thus have really good performance. The Dora is very non-competitive against a P51 or P47 without its MW50 spray. I'm not saying it can't win. I'm just saying you're in for a real problem. So I think that covers all of this stuff. Self-destruct for the IFF, and you're going to use that if you're flying some sort of mission where you don't have MW50 and you need a lot of extra range. Coming over here, this is an important but often ignored thing. Let me tilt down and zoom in a little bit. This is a compensator for varying atmospheric conditions for the gyro gun sight. And it has 2 wheels. We'll call them 1 and 2. That's how they're labeled. And 2, you never adjust. If you look here, under 2, the number is 63. It's at 63, and the wheel's not even enabled in DCS. I believe, and I don't know this with 100% certainty, I think that this number relates to the type of weapons the airplane has. And since we're not going to be changing to a different type of machine guns or cannons, this is fixed at 63. Now, 1 is for altitude. So if you're going to be fighting, let's say, at 0 to 2,000 meters, 0 to 2 kilometers, you're going to want this set to 100. So we'll go ahead and crank that up to 100. Now, if you're at very high altitude, obviously the flight path characteristics of your ammunition is going to be different, less air resistance. So then you're going to need to set this to some other number. In my experience, this doesn't matter a whole lot. It might matter in terms of whether you hit the wing root or the wing at the middle or something like that. It may throw things off a little bit, but even if you don't touch this at all, you're still going to be able to hit things just fine with the gyro gun sight. But procedurally, you should set it. Now, if you're going to be going after B-17s up high, this is a case where you definitely need to set this thing if you're going to be using the gyro gun sight, because American bombers have very effective defensive fire within about 500 meters. And your cannons are very effective as far out as about 800 meters. So when you're attacking bombers, and there are all kinds of different tactics you might want to use, but one of those tactics might be to use the very good accuracy of your gyro gun sight if it's set up properly, and try and hit those bombers with your cannon shells from a safe distance. And you can do that, but you'll need to set this up. Practical, normal, everyday experience, I set this to 100, and then I just kind of forget about it. Now let's scroll back out, tilt forward a little bit, and we're going to talk about the general layout of the cockpit and do the before start flow. So these are all circuit breakers, and these are all circuit breakers. Kurt Tank, who designed the airplane, was an electrical engineer, and he put a lot of thought into this electrical system. One of the things he did, which I really like, is he made everything that he could, in other words, any electrical system that is just either on or off. Instead of having a switch and a circuit breaker, or a switch and a fuse, he used really heavy-duty circuit breakers that could double as switches. Therefore, if you have some sort of emergency situation and you need to figure out where the fuse or circuit breaker is for your nav lights, well, it's right here. It's part of the switch. This turns the nav lights on, that turns them off. And everything in the airplane is that way, with the exception of electrical things that are not either on or off, but may have other functions. For example, landing gear, trim, and flaps. the circuit breakers will only provide power to them, and they'll be controlled by separate switches elsewhere, which we're going to get to. So this is a good setup, and normal airplane, normal day, meaning no drop tank and MW50, you can turn all of these on. You may not want to turn that one on if you're really worried about wasting electrical power or something, but normal airplane, normal day, just to simplify things and speed this up, turn all of these on. So we'll do that right now. And this one's Nav Lights. These two are fuel pumps. This is a fuel pump that is associated with the drop tank, and even though we don't have one, we're turning that on. And this is for the MW50. Now, all of our flows, before engine start, before taxi, everything else, they're going to start here. And usually with this C1 breaker, this is for the nav lights. The nav lights in DCS are very bright, probably unrealistically so. Most simulators are that way. I don't know why. But you should think of them more as anti-collision lights, because that's the way they really function in the sim. So, do I want those on right now? Well, I'm at a friendly airfield, very heavily protected. I'm honestly more concerned about a friendly aircraft running into me than I am about an enemy aircraft seeing me. So yes, I'm going to leave those nav lights on, but I'll be sure to turn them off shortly after takeoff, because they are so bright they'll attract enemy aircraft to you. So all of these are on for right now. Then all of these on. There's one that's kind of hidden here. Hopefully I got it. All of these circuit breakers on, and I'm going to leave this panel open. You'll see why in a minute. Now I'm going to call for rearming and refueling. Once all that's on, the radios are powered up, so just for realism, I do that before I call for rearming and refueling. Keep in mind in DCS, you can call for that before anything's powered up. I guess simulating a ground crewman standing by, looking for hand signals, whatever, I don't know. Alright, I want full fuel, I want full ammo, I want no tracers. Tracers are great, but they give away your position, and I think of the Dora as a hunting airplane, not so much a dogfighting airplane. Well, we can dogfight with it, and we can win in dogfights, but generally speaking, the way you're going to want to use the Dora is using your speed to sneak up on people that aren't checking their low 6 and blast them. And when you blast them, if your first shot misses and you have tracers, now they're alerted to your position, and you're going to have a real fight on your hands. If you're not shooting tracers, they're not going to know you're there. Also, tracers are visible from a large number of angles and a great distance. So when you fire tracers, every enemy around there knows where you are, and they all attack you. Going with no tracers really helps the stealth aspect of the airplane, so that's why I'm doing that. We have a number of things we can select: rockets, bombs, external drop tank. I'm not taking any of that today. And then you can select your paint scheme and number. So while the ground crew rearms and refuels my airplane, we'll continue going through our procedure. Now we're going to close up the canopy, and when we do that, we're going to watch these forward circuit breakers here and make sure I got them all, and I did. Now, just a bit of trivia. Of course, if I had track IR, I could lean over and see all these breakers more easily, but I don't have that hooked up at the moment because, for the reasons I discussed earlier. If you find after takeoff that your trim doesn't work, it's this forward breaker. That one didn't work for you. So this is all good. Now I can close this.
Rearming complete.
And we're going to come up to here and we're going to turn on our oxygen. Let's zoom in a bit. We have three things here related to the pilot's oxygen. The valve that opens or closes it. This is the gauge, which shows system pressure. Apparently the pressure is not taken directly from the bottle. It's somewhere aft of this valve because it's showing 0 right now. And this is a little device that will blink, showing that everything's working fine. So I'm going to rotate this, and when I do, you'll see the gauge come up and you'll see that start to blink. So I rotate this all the way until it stops rotating clockwise. And as you see, the gauge came up. That's great. And this is blinking. Now, I believe in real life this would only be blinking if the pilot was actually breathing the oxygen. But in DCS, this blinks all the time once it's on, so that's fine. All right, I'm going to scroll out a little bit. Tachometer Fuel. This is the fuel gauge. These are low-level lights. And this is the selector. Again, without head tracker, I can't lean over and see the far right side, but This means the gauge is reading the forward tank, and this is the gauge reading the rear tank. They're both full, and this is where I'm going to leave it. Coming across here, this is at 0. This is the water methanol pressure gauge. That'll be a very important gauge when we talk about getting maximum performance out of the engine. It's not that important right now. Oil temperature, coolant temperature, obviously those are reading very low. And fuel and oil pressure, also very low. Fuel selector valve. Looks like a landing gear handle. It's not. It's the fuel selector valve. And you're going to put that all the way up, and 99 times out of 100, you're going to put it all the way up and leave it there. Now, the times when you won't have it there will be sometimes if you're using an external fuel tank, you may not have it there. If you are a really great pilot and you think that you can get a little more performance out of the airplane with a more aft CG, you may want to burn a little bit extra out of the front tank before you go into combat. I don't know that the CG effect on performance is modeled in DCS, nor do I think it would be that great in the Dora anyway, but just as a for instance, you could do that. Or if you were leaking fuel out of one tank and you knew that, I don't know how you would know that, maybe a wingman's looking at your airplane and he's sure that you're leaking out of the rear tank. Well, then you may want to burn out of the rear tank because you're leaking the fuel out anyway, and maybe you're concerned about range. You want to burn that fuel as fast as you can before it all leaks out. So there may be cases where you're not going to have this all the way up, but I'm just telling you 99 times out of 100, and certainly for purposes of what we're doing today, put that thing all the way up and leave it there. Now we're going to come down and we're going to turn on our magnetos. That's M1, one magneto, M2, that's the other magneto. We shove this thing all the way forward to both magnetos. What is a magneto? A magneto is a self-contained ignition system. If it was a car, you would think of it as an older car anyway, a coil and distributor all in one. And it is not powered by the aircraft's electrical system, not the main electrical system. Each magneto has its own little electrical power generator that gets its power from engine rotation. So if the engine is rotating, the magnetos will work and they will fire the spark plug. So if you have a total electrical failure in the Dora, or pretty much any aviation engine is going to be set up this way. I've never flown one that isn't. We're talking about piston engines now. Any aircraft piston engine is going to have dual magnetos for redundancy. So if we lose a magneto due to battle damage, or one just fails, the engine will continue to run just fine on the other one. Now each cylinder, and this is also typical of aviation engines, each cylinder, and there are 12 of them, has 2 spark plugs. And the way all this is wired is that one magneto, let's say the one on the right side of the engine, will fire all of the aft spark plugs, and the one on the left side of the engine will fire all of the forward spark plugs. I don't know that it's that way in the Dora, okay? It could be opposite, but the point is one magneto fires one plug on every cylinder. So a loss of a magneto is not going to be a really big deal. You will lose a little bit of power and efficiency because dual spark plugs going off is better than one, especially because of the way they're located in these aircraft engines. But put this thing all the way forward, both magnetos, and don't worry about it until we do our before takeoff checklist. That's all you have to do with this for now. Now we're going to come back to here. This is the throttle. This is also a twisty grip for the gyro gunsight. We'll talk about that later. The throttle is in the idle cutoff position. You shut the engine down by moving this all the way back, and that cuts off fuel to the motor. Why do we shut the motor off that way? The reason we shut the motor off that way is because of something we talked about just a moment ago, the magnetos. Imagine if we just clicked the magnetos off, which we could do. Let's say we came in to shut down and we just did this, and it just shut off the ignition like it's a car. Well, the engine will shut down just fine. The problem is, if a mechanic or somebody else comes by and needs to turn the propeller, which they often do on old warplanes, when he rotates the propeller, if the magneto's grounding wire isn't grounding properly, the magneto's shut off by grounding. I know it sounds kind of odd, that's the way they work. If the grounding wire isn't working properly and he rotates that propeller, the magneto is going to fire the spark plugs, and there's still fuel in those cylinders because you shut it off with the ignition. So we don't do that. We turn off aircraft engines by killing the fuel to the motor, and in the case of the Dora, that means pulling this handle all the way back to the engine shutdown position. So to start the engine, well, it's never going to start with it here because it's in a fuel cutoff position. We need to put it forward to here, and that is done by pressing Alt Home, at least by default in DCS. So we'll press that now, and the throttle lever moves forward, and now it's in the idle position, and the engine will start with it right there. So let's review this flow, because I know this, I've talked about other things, this is convoluted, but I want you to understand how easy and fast it is to set up the Dora for start. All of these breakers on, all of these breakers on. Roll the canopy closed, oxygen on, come across, look at your gauges, primarily making sure you've got fuel. This all the way up, Magnetos, and back to here. So you're making a big counterclockwise circle, and once you get this into the idle position, you come over here, flip this up, and this is the switch for the starter motor. Now the starter motor in the Dora and almost any World War II aircraft or aircraft engine that is of substantial size, piston engine we're talking about, is going to have an electric starter motor. But the electric starter motor is not big enough to crank over the engine because the engine's gigantic, right? So if you had an electric starter big enough to start that engine, that'd be a lot of extra weight you'd be dragging around, plus a lot of electrical power and wiring that would have to go to that starter. They just don't do it that way. It has a small electric motor that spins up a flywheel, and because it's a small motor, it takes a while to spin up the flywheel. When the flywheel is spinning fast enough, it engages the motor, it connects to the motor via a clutch, and the inertia in that flywheel will crank the motor over, hopefully enough to start it. If not, you got to spin the thing up again. Most World War II big engines are started this way. There are probably some exceptions, and certainly in the civilian world they are, but most World War II engines are started this way. And this does work really well. It just takes some time to get it going. It makes an interesting sound too. In fact, the sound is often associated with certain science fiction sound effects, specifically the Millennium Falcon's hyperdrive, but a lot of others as well. So we're going to press this down and we're going to hold it for about 20 seconds. That's about how long it's going to take to spin itself up to the point where it can start the engine. You don't need to time it for 20 seconds. You can if you want, but you can just listen to it, and as I'm not sure if the sound comes through in this video or not, but it makes a pretty distinctive sound, and when you hear that it's not spinning any faster, that means it's peaked, it's going as fast as it can, and then you're going to pull up on this. Left click pushes it down, right click pulls up. So I let go of the left click. There's no rush here, that flywheel's got a lot of inertia in it. Now I'm going to right click, pull this thing up, and I should be looking up. Alright, the propeller's turning over, the engine started. Now I'm going to close this, and that's all you need to do. You do not need to jockey the throttle or mixture levers or any of that in the 190. You pull, if you've set everything up properly, when you spin that flywheel up and then pull up on that thing to engage the clutch, boom, that engine's running. So now we're in a situation where we're in a plane on the ground, engine's running. This is very much the configuration you would have if you hopped into the airplane hot. In other words, if you selected that option, which you could do on the Wolfpack server, the engine would already be running and the cockpit would be almost exactly set up like this. Not quite, but our before taxi flow will cover things either way. So before taxi, again, we're going to start here. Now in this case, I'm going to leave the nav lights on, but you may want to turn them off if you know you're going to go into combat right away. But these will be on if you get into the airplane and it's been hot started by the mechanic. I'm going to come up here. Okay, that's already closed. That's already closed. The next thing is the tachometer. Now I'm going to hold my brakes. See my toe brakes there? I'm going to come up to 1,000 RPM. Now the plane won't move at 1,000 RPM, but if you overdo it like I just did there, maybe it will. So that's why I hold the brakes. All right, we're at 1,000 RPM. That ensures a proper warm-up, and also the propeller will throw enough air back through the oil and radiator coolers that the engine will not overheat on the ground in this situation, at least not on a Normandy summer map, which is what we're on. And notice I've not touched the cowl flaps, and I'm going to talk about cowl flaps later. You do not need to touch them right now. In fact, it's better if you don't. Now I'm going to scroll. After the tack, I'm going to come up here, and I need to set up the weapons. So I'm going to turn the gyro gun sight on. and we're going to talk about this more later. Even if you're not going to use the gyro gun sight, turn the gyro gun sight on. There's some really good reasons for doing that. I see a lot of people that don't set up the gun sight properly. I don't know why that is. The gun sight is set for almost point blank range. Without head tracker you can't see it, but I'm going to pull this, I'm going to change the range down to about 400 meters, which will be right about there. And then I'm going to set the wingspan. Now, I don't know what kind of an aircraft I'm going to encounter in flight, but I'm going to set the wingspan to this, the wingspan adjustment to this first line here. Why? Because that covers both Spitfire and Mustang, or close enough for government work. And since that covers two airplanes in one, I figure that's the most likely position I'll be needing. If I encounter another airplane, I'll readjust this. So, if we encounter a Spitfire or a Mustang, and its wingspan fits from here to here exactly, and also some other conditions, if this ball has to be in the center, and if our altitude adjuster, which we just looked at, was just right, when I pull this trigger, if that plane is perfectly framed in there, I'm going to hit the target. It calculates the lead. It does a wonderful job of all of that. The exception is that it doesn't respond instantly. So if you're flying a target that's jinking all over the place and being really aggressive, you may want to turn off the gyro gun sight. But in almost anything else, the gyro gun sight will be very helpful. Alright, so there are 4 things to do up on this panel. We did 3 of them. Range, gyro power on, wingspan, and master arm. I'm going to turn that on now. Some of your purists out there might want to do that later in your after takeoff checklist, but or after takeoff flow, but I'm turning it on now. Then I'm going to come down here. I'm going to turn on, or more correctly, arm. Think of this as an arming switch. MW50 system is now armed. So when I push the throttle far enough forward, it's going to trigger. Now there are times you're going to want this switch off, so I have it bound to a key on my button on my joystick. And this is going to sound strange. It's going to make sense later. The time you're going to want that off is when you find yourself in the victim of a long stern chase. You're being chased by multiple P-51s and you don't want to turn and fight. There's a specific situation where you're going to want to turn that off. And I know that doesn't make sense right now, just go with it. It's going to make sense later. Now we're going to come down here and we're going to select takeoff flaps. If we took the plane hot, that would already be selected. The mechanic would have done that for us. But I have a flow here that takes care of either case. So once again, you're before taxi flow. Start here, nav lights on or off, 1000 RPM. You've got 4 things to do up here. Water methanol, flaps, and you're ready for taxi. Now you could call to get permission and whatnot. I'm going to do that. There's a war. I'm not going to do that. There's a war on. Pulling the stick all the way back locks the tail wheel. I'm just going to say right now, in the Dora, you want to taxi it around with the tail wheel locked. If you're really, really good, you can have it unlocked and taxi. And sometimes I will for example, this 90-degree turn I've got to make right as I leave the grass and get onto the concrete. For cases like that, I might unlock the tail wheel, but you're just going to save yourself a lot of pain by locking that tail wheel all the time. So I've locked it. I'm going to bring the power up to 1700 RPM. If you're going much over 1700 and you're taxiing, you're probably, maybe you've got a flat tire, you're stuck in the mud, or you're just not handling the plane right. So 1700 RPM, I let go and I start tapping that brake, and notice I've still got the tail wheel locked. Be a little easier for this turn right here if I unlocked it, but I just want to demonstrate because this is just an easier way. And it will get going pretty fast at that 1700 RPM. Now, it may look like I'm going a little bit off the taxiway because I was stubborn and didn't unlock the tail wheel, but it's going to be just fine. And how do you know, by the way, if your main wheel is off the taxiway? Well, I'm going to show you that here. In fact, let me get it right. I'm going to bring it to a stop here because there's something I want to demonstrate. Plus, we'll do the before takeoff checklist over here somewhere. Okay, this is a good spot to bring it to a stop. Okay, let me get it straightened up a little bit better. Okay, here's what I want to show for purposes of taxiing. See this corner here? There's one on this side. If you can see pavement through this corner, then your main wheels are on the pavement. And this is how you know you're not going into the mud. And this is how pilots of real airplanes do it too. In fact, in the 767 manual, it has specific things. It's like there'll be, you know, this part of the dash lines up with where the engine is, and this one is the wingtip, and so on and so forth. In the Dora right now, all we care about is the main wheel. So I know with 100% certainty that my main wheel is on the pavement because I can see pavement right here. And we'll go to an external view and take a look. And you can see it's not even close. In fact, I'll bet most of you thought it was going to be right on the line, but no, that's not the way it works. So as long as you keep this in view, you're on the pavement with room to spare. Now, let's talk about the before takeoff flow or procedure. And this is not from a Dora manual. This is just something that I've heard, but I've heard it from World War II guys. I should say I started flying for a living in the late 1980s, and I took my commercial check ride and my certified flight instructor check ride. Both of those check rides were given to me, administered by ex-World War II P-51 pilots, and so I talked about a fair amount of stuff with them. I'm sure both those guys are long passed away. The guy that did my commercial license, his name is Bill Shields. A lot of people knew him. Anyhow, the before takeoff checklist that they would frequently do is something they called a cigar check, and this seems to work in really any World War II fighter. And cigar stands for controls, instruments, gas, attitude, trim, run up. You can do this very fast. We're going to go over it kind of slow because we're covering various system things. Oh, bad Greg, I let this dwindle down. RPM here needs to be at 1,000. I forgot to bring it back up when I came to a stop. Normally I won't miss that because I hear the sound of the engine, but I have the sound turned down so it doesn't come back through on my microphone and mess up my voice recording. Anyway, so let's talk about this. Controls, instruments, gas, attitude, trim, run up. So controls, that's self-explanatory. It means flight control. So grab the stick and put your thumb up. So right now my thumb is up. Just go with it and envision that. Now, move the stick to the left, and I'm going to look over to the left. Sorry about the scrolling effect of my view. Oh, you can see how bright my nav light is out there on the wingtip. Alright, now, but we're doing the control check. Stay focused. The left aileron is up. So my thumb, which is up, is pointing to the left aileron. So I know that it's not rigged backwards. Now I know that it's a simulator, it's not going to be rigged backwards in DCS. But in a real airplane, that does happen, and it does cause accidents when it happens. So you want to catch it. So when you're doing your control check, you're checking for proper movement, but also that it's connected properly. So thumb up goes to the up aileron. So the left aileron's good. Let's take a look at the right aileron. Thumb up, right aileron's up, that's down, and look all the way at the back. I'm going to check the rudder and the elevators, and if I was really thorough, I'd check it on both sides. I can't imagine they would not be interconnected, but that's what we're doing. Alright, so that takes care of controls. We're going to continue on with the cigar. Instruments. Hey, let's zoom in a little bit. Instruments is sort of all-encompassing. There are a lot of them to check. Our attack is good, got plenty of fuel, and temperatures are coming up nicely. And again, I want to remind you, we have not touched the cowl flaps. Fuel and oil pressures look good. And we have these instruments to be concerned with here as well. This is manifold pressure, and you know, let's just talk about this for a minute. Normally this is something I would check while I'm taxiing, but and this has literally probably saved my life in real airplanes. I worked for an airline once that had a large fleet of piston engine aircraft. I think it was the largest fleet in the world at the time. And one of the checks they had us do was comparing manifold pressure to RPM. So let's just say, I'm just going to make up something here and say right now we're at 0.7 ATA, and that's giving us 1600 RPM. So I would be familiar with what manifold pressures would give what RPM values. Or let's go to 0.8 ATA. This is not a valid check at very, very low RPM, by the way. The thing has to be significantly off idle for this to matter. Alright, so I got 0.8 ATA, and I have 1850 RPM. So let's suppose I get in the airplane one day and I do this, and I've got 0.8 ATA, that's hard to say, but it's only got 1500 RPM. Well, I know that's way too much to be something having to do with atmospheric conditions or normal wear and tear. There's something wrong with that engine. In the case of the air-cooled piston engines I used to fly, in almost every case it meant that it had a cracked cylinder. So that's just an interesting check, so you can compare manifold pressure to RPM. But normally I do that through taxiing. It wouldn't really be a part of the cigar check. Then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to set my heading indicator. It defaults to this situation where the north on the heading card is up there, and then the plane turns to point to whatever heading the plane is on. So the heading is on a 252, let's say, degree heading right now. You may want to rotate this, see it rotates, to put the airplane so that it's pointing straight ahead. This helps when you're in flight with navigation. It also helps when you get a report from the radar controller saying that there's an enemy, bearing 330. You know exactly which direction to look. Where when this is north with north up, well, you still know which direction to look, but it's just a little bit more confusing. So just be aware you can rotate this. I normally don't. Personal preference, I suppose. Coming across here, this is the attitude indicator, and I want to rotate this thing so that it's on. The reason for caging the attitude indicator, or rotating that all the other way so that the attitude indicator won't work, is so that if you're doing hardcore aerobatics, you won't damage or shorten the life of this thing. We need to keep in mind, A, it's a simulator. I'm not shortening the life of anything. And B, the life expectancy of a 190 Dora 9, I mean, when these things came out, the war in the air was effectively over. I seriously doubt anybody was really going to fly a Dora and the engine was going to make it all the way to its TBO. That's time between overhauls, or time before overhaul. I don't think that you're going to get any life out of these airplanes anyway, so just turn the dang thing on and don't worry about it. Alright, so that takes care of instruments. So we did controls, instruments, gas. Okay, easy peasy. We want our fuel pumps on. Those are these two. We want to check our fuel quantity. We weren't leaking like crazy. If this was down to half a tank or something right now, we know something's seriously wrong. And the selector is on both. So we've checked our gas. Now, the engine will run perfectly fine. In fact, I'll turn these fuel pumps off. That was the forward fuel pump and aft. Notice they're in order. Thank you, Kurt Tank. The engine will keep running just fine with those pumps off. The purpose of these pumps is, well, it's twofold. One, there are situations where you may want to burn out of one tank and not the other, involving manipulation of the fuel selector valve and the three fuel pump switches that are back here, which are these three. So that's one case. Another reason that these need to be on is because at high altitude you could get fuel vapors and get vapor lock. The engine has engine-driven pumps. That's why it continues to run when I shut these off. But those engine-driven pumps are near the engine. And at high altitude, you may get fuel vapors forming between the tanks and those engine-driven pumps and vapor lock them into the engine. So these pumps need to be on for high altitude work. I'm going to say nominally above 20,000 feet. There's nothing in the manual specific about that I've ever seen, nor have I tested that in DCS. But I have tested that it will run at low altitude forever with these pumps off. So just be aware of that. All right, so back to our cigar check. And I realize I'm going off on all these detours, but that's kind of part of what I'm trying to show. So controls, instruments, gas. We've done the gas part. Attitude trim. I'm going to have to move the throttle to see it. So this is the switch. Of course, I've got it on a hot button. I'm going to set it to 0. Pull this back to 1,000 RPM now. Like I say, I only moved it so I could see the gauge because I can't move my head without head tracker. Alright, and run up. So we did controls, instruments, gas, attitude trim, run up. The run up checks the mags, and it is something that everybody always does when you're flying a piston engine airplane. If you go over to, for example, iFly Central's channel, he's probably got a video where he does the run up. He has a lot of really good real world airplane stuff. Alright, let's move the throttle up. There would be a specific RPM level in the manual at which you would do this. I don't know what it is for the Dora, but it doesn't matter. We're going to use 2000, and we're going to use 2000 because it's just a nice tick mark there, and we'll be able to, at least as close as I can get to 2000 with my crappy Thrustmaster throttle. Wife bought me new joystick and throttle, though. Get those hooked up soon, but right now that's what we got. Okay, so I'm going to call that close enough to being right at 2000. And, oh great, now I can't see my Magneto switch. So you know what, we're going to have to close this down for just a minute. I'm going to have to get the head tracking set up, and I'll be right back. Okay, I've got my head tracker set up. Let me get my views back to default. Okay, so that's the default zoom. This is the zoom level that I use for startup, taxi, takeoff, anytime I'm firing the guns at a target, and generally I fly around in this level of zoom. I'll zoom out if I'm in a dogfight, and I'll zoom in sometimes if I'm trying to identify something at a distance. Alright, but now I can move my head, thanks to head tracking software, and manipulate the Magneto switch. So see, it was on M1 plus 2, and we're still at 2000 RPM. So we're going to pull this thing back to M2, and what do you think is going to happen? Well, hopefully the engine keeps running. So there we go. But also, RPM should drop a little bit. And, well, I don't know. Let's go back over here. Let's go back to 2. Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, it comes up a little bit. I just didn't have it exactly at 2000, and the parallax issue is a factor here. So it's slightly above 2000 when it's on 2. Okay, there we go. And it drops a little bit. So that's what we want to see. And then we go back to running both mags. Power came back up. And now we check the number 1 mag. And power dropped again. So we know that both magnetos work. So we've got our system redundancy going for us. And now we're going to pull this back to 1000 RPM. So that's it for the cigar check. So it was controls, instruments, gas, attitude, trim, run-up, and we're ready for takeoff. Now I'm not going to do a takeoff now because that is a whole video in itself. DCS correctly models, at least to the extent that I think it's possible in a simulator, and more so than any other sim I've ever seen. DCS correctly models the P-factor and gyroscopic precession, in other words, some of the turning effects of the propeller. And when you understand those things, taking off in the Dora is actually really easy, but at least if you're on pavement. But I just don't want to get into a whole takeoff video right now. That would just add way too much. I just want to talk about the cockpit layout and the flows. So we talked about these flows. The before start checklist, we start here, we go around this way, and back to here. Before taxi, again, we start here, come up here, tack, and then set up the weapons panel, arm MW50, and takeoff flaps. For before takeoff, we do our cigar check, which we just did. Now, after takeoff checklist is going to be largely the same flow as the others, or after takeoff flow, I should say. I don't know that there's actually a checklist in the Dora. I've not seen one. There probably was, but I don't have it. So, the after takeoff flow, again, we're going to start here. And what are we going to do? Well, I don't want my nav lights on anymore because I'm getting away from the airport, my friendly area. So, and I don't want to forget them. So this is when I turn them off. So after takeoff, let's suppose we're in the air. We did our takeoff procedure properly and everything. And we're climbing out. So I turn that off. Then I go in the same sort of direction. I come up here. I'm going to set climb power, which will be 3000 RPM. We're going to talk about power levels in this thing in a few minutes. Then I'm going to come up here and check for 3 red lights. If I don't have those red lights, the guns aren't going to fire. And if I don't have them, it's because the master arm here was off. So you want your master arm on at this point, certainly shortly after takeoff. And by the way, this is the only switch. You can turn all of these breakers off here. None of that affects this. This is independent. And then I'm going to come down here and check for, well, we're not actually in flight, so you can't see it, but I should have 3 red lights here. Okay, these lights, these outboard ones are the main landing gear. The middle one are the flaps. And yellow indicates takeoff flaps. If everything is up, I'll have these 3 red lights here. So After takeoff checklist. Nav lights, make sure those things are good. Make sure power's set for climb, because sometimes I'll use a different power setting for takeoff other than 3,000 RPM. I'll use 3250, even with MW50 spraying if I'm really in a hurry or really short field. And sometimes I'll use 2700, that's another story for another day. Then come up here, we're looking for 3 red lights, and then we're looking for 3 red lights here. And once that's done, that completes the after takeoff checklist, or climb checklist, whatever you want to call it, or climb flow. And then you're going to continue on and deal with things in flight. Now, before landing, I may as well cover that. In World War II, people usually did something called a Gump Check, which stands for Gas Undercarriage Mixture Prop. It's considered very unprofessional, by the way, today to use cigar or Gump, but I'm telling you, this is what people did back then. And I know that because I've talked to a lot of them. So Gump Check, gas, so we're going to make sure, our fuel pumps are on, we're feeding from a tank that has fuel. Undercarriage, okay, that's a button right here, it's this green button. Mixture does not apply to the Dora, that's all function of this, and prop, that's again all function of the single layer, so we don't really need to do it. So it's really just a gas undercarriage in the Dora. And but for purposes of flying other airplanes, I think of it as gas undercarriage mixture prop. That's it for the procedural stuff. Now I want to talk about how we're going to get all the power we can out of the Dora. So I'm going to turn off my track IR here. Hopefully this goes well and doesn't get too upset. We'll see. And then we're going to talk about getting everything we can out of this thing. Okay, success. Well, more or less, we're a little bit tilted, but well, let me see if I can fix that. Never mind, we're not going to. You're just going to have to live with this being a little bit tilted. All right, power settings. In the Dora, power is set by RPM, not by manifold pressure. This is very different from every other World War II fighter I know of. Normally, you set RPM, and then you adjust manifold pressure for power. In the Dora, everything is based on RPM. And yes, I know that there's a DCS video where they have an interview with a Dora pilot, and he specifically says that they set everything by manifold pressure. Well, I'm sure he did that. That's not what the manual says. And there's a YouTube channel, you may be familiar with it, called Agathos Flight School. I believe he's a German fellow. In any event, he clearly speaks German. And he's gone through all of these manuals, and he personally knows that Dora pilot, and he asked him specifically about this. He said, why did you say you guys were setting power by manifold pressure? The manual says differently. And the German real Dora pilot's answer was that, and I'm hugely paraphrasing here, go to Agathos Flight School and watch his stuff to get the real story, the full story, I should say. But the reason was that the airplanes showed up without manuals. These things show up, at your airbase one day, and the commanding officer says, hey, there's B-17s inbound, go fly and deal with this threat. They didn't even have the manuals, and they probably didn't have the time to flip through them, so they just operated the airplane the way they always did. But in the Dora, the way it's set up is you set power by RPM, and then the engine computer will adjust manifold pressure to the optimal level and take care of power for you. So it really simplifies things. Now, in the Dora, 3,000 RPM in the manual is listed as climb or combat power. 2,700 RPM is listed specifically in the manual. I'm talking about the real World War II manuals here. 2,700 RPM is listed specifically as maximum continuous power. However, the manual doesn't have any time limit on that 3,000 RPM climb or combat power setting. Therefore, in practical terms, while it may shorten the engine life, but I don't think that really matters for reasons I talked about earlier, you can run 3,000 RPM all day long. You can run it until the plane runs out of fuel, and it will be just fine. Like I say, it may mean that the valve guides are going to wear out in 72 hours instead of 75 or whatever, but it's something that in practical terms just doesn't matter either in the war or in the simulator. So use 3,000 RPM as your maximum continuous power number, and you're golden. Now, if you go to full power. We're talking MW50 on. Okay, the switch is on, and you shove this all the way forward. And in fact, I'm going to do that for a second here, and I'm going to hold the brakes. Watch this gauge, and you'll see this. There we go. Boom. Now we know we're flowing MW50 like there's no tomorrow. You get the tail back on the ground before something bad happens. Get this thing back to 1,000 RPM. But my tail wheel's still okay. Anyway, if this gauge comes up, you know you're spraying, and I'll reference this gauge a lot, which we'll talk about in a minute. So with this armed, full forward here, and this will go to 3250, you'll start spraying, and manifold pressure will come way above what it would without the MW50, and you can run the plane in this configuration for 10 minutes. Actually, in DCS, you can run it for between 12 and 14 minutes before the engine just plain fails. However, book-wise, you can absolutely run it for 10 minutes, and that's what I recommend you do. Now, how do you know when your 10 minutes is up? Well, you could have your iPhone or something with you, but if you want to be really authentic, you come down here, and you press this little guy here, and now the second hand is sweeping, and there's a little minute hand, and when that little minute hand gets to about this position, that's 10 minutes. So if you hit this, and maybe you could have that on a hotkey on your joystick. I don't, I'm not that authentic here, but if you want to, have this on a button on your joystick. When you go to war emergency power, whatever they call it here, hit this, and you can run that for 10 minutes. Now, if you're in a situation where you're being chased by a couple P-51s or whatever is chasing you, you don't want to turn and fight. You're running for home, and hopefully, if you're running, you're heading towards home, towards friendly anti-aircraft fire, or something like that, or sometimes towards known friendly aircraft, leading people into a trap. In any case, when you're in this situation, you're at 3250 RPM, MW50 spraying, and you're really anywhere below 20,000 feet. You're going, which is nominally, let's just say 6,000 meters. I think it's a little higher than that, but let's say 6,000 meters or below. When you're set up like this, you are going to outrun every Allied airplane in the sky. Not by much. If you're within gun range of a P-51, he may be able to hose you down from long range before you're safely away. But if you're maintaining distance and you go to this power setting, you're going to gain on him. The problem is, in 10 minutes, let's say our 10 minutes is up. Well, now what do? We can pull it back to max continuous, 3,000 RPM, and continue on our merry way. But the P-51, if he's at his war emergency power, will gain on you if you're at 3,000 RPM. Not by much, but he will. So, here's what you want to do. This is what I was talking about earlier. You want to turn off your MW50 and leave the throttle all the way forward. It'll maintain 3250 RPM. You'll lose the cooling benefit of the MW50, and you'll lose the anti-knock, which means that the engine management computer is going to have to pull manifold pressure back a bit. So you're going to lose some power. But the Dora can run for 30 minutes at 3250 with the MW50 off. So you can run the plane for a really long time in this configuration. And while the Mustang may be very slowly gaining on you, it's not going to be enough, because after you do this for 10 minutes, now you can switch your MW50 back on and run it for another 10 minutes. So you can run for 30 minutes with 20 of it, provided there's an interval where it's not on for 10 minutes, but you can run for 30 minutes spraying MW50 for 20. And in 30 minutes, you should be able to get back to friendly territory or get to friendly anti-aircraft fire. A 30-minute tail chase would be ridiculous. In fact, both planes would be running low on fuel at that point. So the Dora has plenty of performance engine-wise to get itself out of trouble. Okay, real life interrupted my video there, so we're back. We're back in exactly the same airplane, same configuration, although we're back in our parking spot because I had to start over. But now I have Track IR, my head tracker, hooked up, so we can look over here, and you can see this range adjustment for the gun sight we couldn't see before. That's adjusted by twisting this grip. I actually, of course, have it on a hotkey. So I set it here to about 400, which is a really good spot at which to open fire when you're sneaking up on somebody. Now, like I say, with bombers, you may want it at 800 because you can shoot at them from outside the effective range of their 50 caliber. Now that may look really small, but remember we're shooting a bigger airplane, so we'll roll that over to 31.6, and you can see that actually is about the same picture as a fighter, a Spitfire or something at 400 meters. So just keep that in mind. All right, where we left off before I had to get another airplane was we talked about power. 3,000 RPM is effectively your maximum continuous number, although 2,700 is the official number. But you can run 3,000 all day long. And if you're running from people, MW50 on and full throttle will give you 3250, lots of manifold pressure. It'll vary depending on the altitude. And below 20,000 feet, you can outrun everybody. 10 minutes later, turn off your MW50. You could go as long as 12 to 14 minutes, but do that at your own risk. I'm promising you 10 minutes will be fine. Turn it off, run at 3250 for 10 more minutes, and then you can turn it on again and run MW50 for 10 more minutes. And by that point, there's nowhere on the Normandy map you would not have easily made it to safety, so you're going to be just fine. Now, since I have my head tracker working, I can come way down. Well, hopefully it'll let me come down there. And let me try zooming out a little bit. Yeah, okay. I know this is a pain, but down here, right there, that's a little wheel. Okay, so you've seen it. I'm going to go back to normal view. That manually opens the cowl flaps. Here you can see a cowl flap there, there's another one there, and there are various places around the cowling. Not everywhere, of course, the cowling has to be able to attach itself to the airframe, but there are cowl flaps all around the cowling. Now, the manual says, at least the DCS manual in this case, says to open them all the way up for taxi. I find that's totally unnecessary, and I never do it. Here's the problem I've found. The automatic, well, maybe not a problem, but here's what I found. And I've experimented with cowl flaps a lot because neither the DCS manual nor the German manuals, at least as I interpret what's written there, make total sense to me. But in lots of testing, this is what I've found. If you never touch the cowl flaps and you're on the Normandy summer map, there may be some hotter map somewhere where it's going to be a factor, but if you never touch the cowl flaps, you will never have a problem with the engine overheating. It will be just fine. They have an automatic function, and they will close up to the point that they optimize performance while providing adequate cooling. So normal plane, normal day, don't touch the cowl flaps. Now there are cases where I will touch the cowl flaps. One, if I've taken damage to my cooling system and I know I'm spewing coolant out and I want to get a little bit more life out of the motor, I'll crank those cowl flaps all the way open in hopes that when the coolant runs out, my motor will be starting from a cooler spot, and thus I'll have more time before it overheats and utterly fails. I don't know that DCS engine mechanics are modeled to that level, but that's just the way I think of it. Also, if I know I need a little bit greater burst of speed because I'm in some really dire situation and I'm willing to sacrifice, my engine, I'll close the cowl flaps all the way up, accepting that my engine's not going to last very long. But generally speaking, leave those things in automatic, never touch them, because as far as I can tell, once you put them into manual mode, you can't get them back out. Okay, hold on, I'm going to turn off the track IR again, so just bear with me here. I'm going to try and get it all straight before I do it. Okay, success. All right, so the cowl flaps, you don't need to mess with. Now, there is a situation, and again, the reason you don't need to mess with them is once you do mess with them, I can't figure out how to get them back into automatic mode. Once you go into manual, they seem stuck there, and maybe there's a way to get the cowl flaps back into auto if somebody else that uses DCS knows, or maybe has read the Dora manual and has determined something else. Let me know. As far as I can tell, leave them in auto. They work perfectly fine all the time, and if you put them in manual, you're stuck with them in manual for the rest of the flight, and it's very, very hard to regulate those things manually, so they work. Let's go back to getting all the power we can out of this motor. There's a couple things we maybe didn't mention. We went over the basic settings, but there is a situation in which, let's say this. Let's say your automatic engine control has malfunctioned or takes damage, and If that happens, and you find that the engine isn't responding properly to normal throttle inputs, what you can do is pull this handle here, the MBG emergency mode handle. Now when you pull that, okay, first of all, here's how you're going to use this thing. Pull the throttle idle, so the throttle's at idle. Pull this handle, and when you pull it, notice manifold pressure jerks around here. Watch it again. Watch the manifold pressure gauge, and as I pull this, so I'm pulling now. Okay? That's the reason you pull the throttle idle before you pull this thing out, because when you pull this thing out, it causes a bump in manifold pressure, which could cause damage. So to mitigate that threat, pull this to idle, pull this handle out, and now the engine management computer will still kind of work, but kind of in a degraded mode. So now in this situation, you are limited to 2,700 RPM or 1.5 ATA, whichever comes first. And that's your new limit, and you can fly home like that and you'll be just fine. Now if you end up getting into a fight and you need more power, you can go to full throttle with it like this, and it'll go all the way to 3250 and it'll give you a lot of manifold pressure, but your engine life will be only 3 minutes. So when the engine's in this emergency mode, keep in mind that when you start going above 2,700 RPM, you're really playing with fire. So you're only going to need this when you're running for home. And also, okay, I'm going to close this now. So throttle idle, close it, and this goes back to 1,000 RPM. I don't know that DCS has engine damage modeling such that you would ever actually need to pull this, but the point is it does work. And DCS seems to update like every couple of weeks. So who knows? Even if it isn't modeled right now, it might be 2 weeks from now. That covers that. There's 3 other handles here. There's this one, and there's one right above it. These jettison external stores. The one that says rump, think of it as like it jettisons what's below your butt, below your rump. It jettisons the fuselage stores. So pull that. The one above it, which is not visible at the moment, jettisons the wing stores. This emergency handle over here releases the landing gear. Now the way you would do that is you would use that by coming over here and turning off the landing gear circuit breaker. There it is. We'd turn that circuit breaker off because we don't know what's wrong with it. Maybe the landing gear's not coming down because the pump is there. Not the pump. It's an electric motor. The motor is stuck running, trying to pull it up or something. Who knows? In any case, emergency extension of the gear is turn off power to the landing gear motor via the circuit breaker. Pull this, and you may need to waggle the wings left and right a little bit. And then you'll watch for these gear pins here. These are your, well, without the head tracker I can't see both of them, but anyway, these are gear pins which give you an indication in addition to these 2 green lights that tell you that the gear is down. But you may not always have those green lights. Let's talk about that. Again, this is a very electric airplane. Kurt Tank was an electrical engineer, and that was his core engineering principles, let's say. It's really what he focused on. And you might get some sort of electric emergency. Let's suppose you're flying along and all of a sudden you're getting smoke in the cockpit. Well, you probably don't know where that smoke is coming from. Yeah, I mean, maybe you do, but you probably aren't going to know where that electrical smoke is coming from. So what you're going to do is reach up here and hit this button, because you don't want this fire to persist. You want the electrical fire to go out right now. Now when I press this button, watch what happens to these gauges, my gun sight, these lights, basically everything electrical. So I press the button, boom, everything electrical fails except the engine, because the engine's magnetos, of course, are generated by power created by the rotation of the engine. Also, the TAC has its own generator, and the fuel pumps, well, there are mechanically driven fuel pumps by the engine, so the engine will continue to run, even though you've shut off the electric fuel pumps now, unless maybe you're above 20,000 feet and you got a threat of vapor lock, but I'm suspecting if you just hit this button, you're probably diving, heading for home. So if you have an electrical fire, you can hit this button, it kills all electrical power. Now the way it does that is by tripping the battery and generator circuit breakers. So you could come over here and see they're tripped. You could just turn these things back on. This one here it'll light up, it's the battery, it'll tell you that. And then this one's the generator. And which makes sense because you would turn the battery on before the generator. You know, again, this is all made, you're moving forward. Everything's pretty logical by World War II standards in the 190s. So now that button tripped those two breakers, therefore there's no ship's electrical power going anywhere. The only thing that's functioning is stuff that's driven by the engine, and the only things driven by the engine are things needed for the running of the engine. You know, I can press the trigger here, see on the joystick here, press the trigger to fire the guns, but they're not going to fire. Also notice my gun sight went blank. So I do still have an iron sight I could use here though, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So let's say this is our situation. We're in combat, things aren't looking too good, and now we got smoke in the cockpit. Either maybe it was battle damage, maybe just something went haywire in our airplane. We press that button, and we want to get power back on. Well, what you're probably going to want to do is start turning off individually all of these breakers. Let's just say we got those. I don't know that we did. I'm going to turn everything off. Okay, so now when I reestablish electrical power on the airplane via either turning on the battery or generator, we know that if the smoke was coming, let's say, from the landing gear system or the trim system, looks like there, I didn't get that off, it's off now. If the smoke was coming from one of those things, the smoke is not going to continue. So now normally what we do here, once we press that, we're heading for a runway, and we're going to use the emergency gear extension and just fly the plane and land it. But we're creating a scenario here where maybe for some reason you've got to restore the electrical system. What you're going to do is turn everything off, and then you're going to turn on one source of power, either the battery or the generator. The battery in the Dora is right behind the pilot seat. I mean right behind. So maybe if smoke was related to the battery itself, you would already know that and know not to turn that on and turn on the generator instead. But I'm going to go with turning on the battery in this case. So I turn the battery on, and smoke comes back or it doesn't. If the smoke comes back, I'm going to turn the battery off, wait for the smoke to be on, turn the generator on, smoke comes back or it doesn't. Okay, let's say that the smoke let's say that the smoke does not come back when we've got the battery on. Well, now, then I'm going to turn the generator on, still no smoke, and then I'm just going to turn on the things I absolutely need. Notice the guns came back on. Those come on. Turn them off for a second. Turn these off. Notice it won't come on without electrical power. It does not have an independent source of power. But when I turn the battery back on, now I've got guns again. So really with just this, with everything else off but just the battery on, or just the generator on, I've got enough to fly and fight. So the thing is set up so that you can, hit this button, and then even if you're not going to return to land right away, you can, just by Braille method, you can shut all this stuff off, just turn one thing on, either battery or generator, and you're still in the fight. So the plane, in an electrical sense, is set up in a very logical fashion, which I really like. Now, I think that's all I've got on this airplane that I wanted to discuss in this video anyway. There's other stuff. There's rockets, and you can jettison rockets, you can fire the rockets, same with bombs. You can set things to explode on impact or with the delay. There's all kinds of other things in this airplane you can do. There's a whole bunch with the navigation equipment, which is here, and setting up the radio. The radio channel 2 is what's used on this particular map, and it defaults to there. I just leave it there. But there are other things to go over, but hopefully this has helped you understand kind of how to get the most out of the Dora. You can set it up really quickly with your before start flow, and then your before taxi flow. That's the one that goes up to the weapons panel. After takeoff, before landing, all those things are really easy, and I'm hoping that you can get the most performance possible out of the motor. I do know that a lot of people have problems with the engines failing in the Dora, and part of that was the creator's fault. DCS for a long time had a bug in the engine for the Dora. I am now convinced that's fixed. I have spent a lot of time verifying that, and it seems to me that you can run this engine all day long and it will not fail, provided you didn't exceed those limitations I talked about earlier, or if it takes battle damage, it almost always seems to fail right away. If American 50 calibers in DCS hit it somewhere between the windscreen and the propeller spinner, it seems like the engine always, however they have this model at the moment, that always means that engine failure will be imminent. Sometimes not for a while, sometimes not for a few minutes. You can take that to mean, take that as you will. I've just found that to be the case. But short of that, the engine in DCS in the 190 is now very reliable, and it can put out a lot of power for a long time. And if you optimize the airplane the way I talked about, leave the cowl flaps in auto and run the power levels I discussed, you can outrun everybody. So I hope some of you got something out of this video, both flight sim enthusiasts and non-flight sim enthusiasts alike. So that's all for now, and have a great day.